Hello again, fellow audiophiles. I am Wave Theory, and this is the Denafrips Pontus 15th Anniversary Edition R2R Digital to Analog Converter. This goes for approximately $1,500 US as of the filming of this review. Several different retailers have it anywhere from about $1,470 to about $1,580, so we're just going to ballpark it at $1,500 USD. This was sent to me by a friend of the channel. Denafrips does not know that I have this unit in for review. A viewer and a patron said, "Hey, do you want to review this one?" And I was like, "Yeah, I want to review this one. Please send that." And so he very graciously did and let me hang on to it for about 6 weeks now, I want to say, to give it a thorough review and evaluation here, which you are about to receive. If there are any retailers out there who sell this for which I am an affiliate link member, I will put affiliate links down below, although I don't believe Denafrips or Vinshine really does much in the way of affiliate links or uses third-party retailers that often. But this was an interesting review because I have reviewed the original Pontus 2 with a couple of editions of the firmware update in the past, so I will link to that down in the description, as well as the Denafrips Aries 2 and the Aries 12th Anniversary Edition I've done reviews for. So I've had a fair number of Denafrips products in here to do reviews on. And so how does this stack up to them? And at $1,500, where does it stack up in the market here? And why is it sitting on this ugly old piece of shelving for this video? All of those questions answered right after shameless self-promotion.
Hello. I'm one of the reasons that Wave Theory can't spend all of his money on audio gear. He wants you to know that your support is vital for keeping the channel running. So if you enjoy Wave Theory's bussin' review riz and no-cap review style and want to encourage him to stay in the basement so I don't have to listen to his dad jokes as much, like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can also send him a donation on PayPal or sign up for the Patreon. Links are in the description. Now on to the review.
Alright, as often, as is usually the case anyway, there is a lot to cover here, so use the timestamps to jump around and navigate this video and watch the parts that are of most relevance to you. I think this is a pretty solid unit there that slots in at its $1,500 price quite well into the market, because the way the DAC market has shaped up here in recent years is like under roughly $1,000, there are a lot of excellent options. And then there's been a little bit of a hole in the market up until you get to about $2,000, where you get up into the price of something like a Cord Cutest, or sometimes you can grab a Hugo 2 down around that price. And if you get a deal on something like a Shit Yggdrasil or something like that, right around $2,000 or just over is where the DAC market starts to pick up again. And there have been a relatively few units that are like in the middle of the thousands. You know, this one's sitting at $1,500 in there, that are really, in my view anyway, kind of worth the price to performance there at that price point. And this unit, I think, is, and it slots into that price category quite ably and becomes one of the few options for DACs that does so. All right, so let's unpack all of that here through the course of this video. And let's start with features and specs and what is this thing. All right, so this is the latest iteration of Denafrips' Pontus series, right? And those are DACs that have been like kind of like upper middle fi, lower high fi, if you want to come down to like a fine-grained categorization of where they fit in the price performance rate, from a price to performance standpoint in there. So it's not Denafrips' entry-level line, nor is it their high-end line. It's just kind of like a step up from their entry-level units, which I think is mostly the Aries series there. So this is a step above that. All right, then being a Denafrips, then it is a ladder DAC or an R2R DAC in there. So inside this, it has a fully balanced circuit design. There is a resistor ladder for each channel that handles the digital to analog conversion in there. So there's not a single microchip in there, so it's not ESS or AKM or anything like that. It uses a series of resistors to do the digital to analog conversion. Now, it has an unbuffered output on its output output stage coming right off of those resistor ladders. So even though it has balanced and single-ended analog audio outputs, you don't want to use them both at the same time because of that unbuffered output. Choose one and choose the balanced, in my opinion. I'll explain a little bit more why here later in the video. All right. There is also the option of having oversampling and non-oversampling on this unit here. Denafrips website claims that it is a true non-oversampling DAC if you want it to be a non-oversampling DAC, but it does have onboard digital filters on it, which will handle upsampling or oversampling internally in there. There are two flavors of that digital filter, just called fast and slow. When I got the unit, it was in fast mode. I don't know if it comes that way out of the box, or because the person who lent it to me had it in that mode as his preference. I'm not sure, but you can change between the two, and I ended up using slow most of the time. Now, why might you want such an oversampling filter in there or not want it? Well, this DAC can handle sampling rates up to 1536 kilohertz from PCM files at a 24-bit resolution, and then it can also do DSD decoding up to DSD 1024. Those are really high sampling rates there. So the resistor ladder in here is capable of decoding those very, very high sampling rates, and that generally means when you have an R2R DAC that can do that, they are more comfortable operating at those high sampling rates in there. So the oversampling filters that are on board are meant to take more standard sampling rates like 44.1 kilohertz up through about 192 kilohertz and oversample them, raise their sampling rate up to the level that this DAC is more comfortable operating in its circuitry. But you may not like how the particular oversampling filters on this perform, so you have the option of defeating it for all sampling rates and just letting the digital ones and zeros go in right into the resistor ladder network untouched by any filtering or anything like that. Now, you are going to want to use non-oversampling filters on here, or the non-oversampling option here, and bypass all of the internal filters if you are using this as a DAC to decode files that are already highly oversampled. So if you do external oversampling using HQ Player or Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster, or you just have files around that are really, really high in sampling rate, then you're going to want to get the onboard oversampling out of the way and just use the NOS mode there. And I will comment on the sound, the difference between oversampling and non-oversampling for those more everyday sampling rates up to 192 kilohertz, and then I will also talk performance with highly oversampled files coming from both HQ Player and that PGGB, Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster. All right, other than that, you have some other features on here which I will get to, like as we do the unit tour and all of that. Like you can do something fun with the AES inputs if you want, and so forth on there. But that's a lot of just like the basic specs and the price. Other than the internals of this unit have really been redesigned and beefed up really over the 12th anniversary edition that preceded this by oddly less than 3 years. Okay, but whatever the case may be on there, I will leave it to Denafrips' website to explain more of the details about what exactly did change internally here. But they put a lot more care, I don't want to say a lot more care, but they did some redesigning and beefing up of the power supply and things of that nature. So again, click over to their website to get a more thorough explanation of as to how a lot of the internals changed here. Now, I do want to make a couple of comments about the build of the DAC, and then yes, that will lead us into why this piece of ugly old shelving is here between the unit and my tabletop. Okay, the unit is big and it's heavy. It's got an all-metal chassis, and the power supply in it has a couple of toroidal transformers. There is some weight to this thing. It is hefty, so that's one reason why I'm sitting next to it and not holding it up during the course of this review here. So just prepare to have a shelf that is pretty tough on it to put it on and that sort of thing. Like you see my equipment rack behind me. This thing, I had the Hi-Fi Mint Golden Wave Prelude on it, and because it's the feet of this are in a triangular pattern. The back foot in the middle was pushing on the wrong spot on that, and it popped loose of support on one of the shelves of my equipment rack there that I had to glue back on, and then just think more carefully about how I put this in there. The shelf can hold the weight just fine. It's just the way the feet distributed the weight that was an issue for my situation, I think. So that's just something to keep in mind there. So, you know what? Let's go ahead then and cut to the build, and then of course I'll explain why this shelf is in there during the course of that. Here we go. All right, let's get the elephant in the room part of this out of the way first. Why do I have this ugly old piece of shelving here underneath this thing? Well, let me show you. And I realized in the coming clip that I forgot to use my normal microphone and I just used my phone mic. So it might sound a little different, but that's okay. It's quick, and it's just to show you, why is this here? All right, I have flipped the unit over here. Let's look at these feet. Gonna zoom in on one of them here, try to get the one in the best light for it. The edge of these feet right here is kind of sharp. Right, and so that can, just given the weight of this unit, how heavy it is, and the combination of that kind of sharp corner, sharp edge, okay, on that feet there, you just have to be careful what you set this on and if you push it around and slide it around and all of that. So that's why it's on that ugly old piece of shelving that I have here in this video, because I don't want to scratch up my tabletop any more than I already have. Now, in fairness, the Denafrips website does say that this product ships with foot mats, which I assume are something that goes underneath these feet to take some of those sharp edges off. I looked for them in the box that I got. Now, this was a loaner unit from a friend of the channel, so it is entirely possible that they just didn't get sent to me. I'm not real sure, but I do have questions like, why do we need feet that sharp to begin with? What are we really trying to hold on to here? So I just don't get that one, but I will leave it up to you to decide whether or not that matters. All right, front panel of the unit is pretty, you know, just Spartan industrial kind of looking and so forth. Main power button here, really standby on and off. We have a row of LED lights across the front panel here on this, and that corresponds to different actions of the buttons here. So input, minus, and plus just literally means we've got a list of inputs right here. If you're on this input and you hit input minus, you go to this one. Hit it again, you go one more, okay? Hit it back the other way to move back the other way and cycle through like that. We have a phase invert button, 0 degrees or 180 degrees phase there. Here is your oversampling / non-oversampling toggle button right here. When the light is on, NOS is on. Okay, mute button, which also enters like a menu mode too. And then you have a mode button to like toggle through different options. Read the user's manual to see like what combinations of lights will light up to mean different things when you use the combination of mute and mode buttons in there. Like Denafrips models of before, you get these sampling rate indicators here that if you have a DSD signal, that light will light up right there. But for PCM stuff, what you have here is like, do you have a base 44.1 or a base 48 kilohertz file? And then you have a multiplier on there. So if you play a 96 kilohertz file, for example, that one will light up, and then the 2x multiplier will light up. So 48 times 2 is 96 kilohertz on that. So that's, I mean, all these lights are red too. They're not particularly overpowering or anything like that. That's the front panel. Let me just lift the camera up real quick and show you the overall build. You get a metal chassis on this thing, and it is tough. Like, I mean, this is a heavy, heavy unit. All right, here we have the back of a DAC, and fairly standard stuff, right? Analog audio outputs, balanced 3-pin XLR, RCA single-ended right here. Don't run them both at the same time. You have an unbuffered output coming right off of the ladder DAC in the design of this DAC right here. So choose one or the other here and choose the balanced, because it is a fully balanced design. And like most fully balanced designs, it sounds better when it's used as it was designed and built to be used, rather than something that had to be configured to make it happen, right? So there is a performance gap drop here going from XLR to RCA. Use XLR if at all possible. Okay, standard power input here. We have two flavors of coaxial SPDIF input, RCA and BNC. Then we have two AES inputs, which are like SPDIF on a balanced XLR connector there. But as with other Denafrips units, you can use these together to form a single input that's like, you know, dual cable input there if you want, or you can use them as two separate AES inputs. Here we have a Toslink fiber optic SPDIF connection here. We have an I2S input with the HDMI style jack, and then we have the USB input in there as well. Last thing I'll call your attention to on this view, and you can just kind of see it down there, is that this is another one of those units that only has 3 feet on it. So be careful how you stack this and where you put weight on top of this thing, because you can get it to pop a wheelie, okay, on either side there because of that triangular foot configuration. Stop it with the 3-foot thing. Okay, just stop it. Okay, 4 feet, please. And then again, make them so that they don't scratch up the surface of whatever shelf they're on there. That just seems like basic stuff. Please help us out with that. All right, that's mostly the unit tour here. Back to me on camera talking about other things. So again, well-built, well-made, handsome unit that is quite heavy, and the feet thing is just really up to you. I didn't have the foot pads to try out. I don't even really know what they look like, so hopefully other reviewers have pictures of those for you so you can see what they look like. Yeah, you'll just have to decide whether or not those work for you or they don't for your situation. All right, so let's start transitioning into sound and all of that. So as usual, let's talk about the test gear that I use for this, and it's a long list. All right, because of the nature of this thing being able to handle really highly upsampled files, I used a few different sources. So I'm an all-digital listener here, and so all of the root audio files that I used would have been lossless or high-res FLAC files. Here, defining high-res to top out at 192 kilohertz PCM files, or I would use DSD files, usually just DSD64 as the raw file type there. And I would stream the FLAC files from Qobuz or play them locally, or I'd play the DSD files locally over Roon. So then Roon endpoints that would have serviced this DAC here would have been Sonor Ultra Rendu streamers, or at times a Cord 2Go plus 2U DDC. The Ultra Rendu would have been routed through a Singer SU6 DDC and then connected via I2S or SPDIF coax into either the I2S or the coax input of the Denafrips here. The 2Go plus 2U would have been a direct USB into this, and then I also connected a direct USB from my Mac Mini computer in here, which has HQ Player on it in there, so to check upsampling there via the USB input on there. That's how that got connected. And that Mac Mini also has Audirvana on it, so files that I upsampled through PGGB would have been played through Audirvana on that little Mac Mini as well. All right, downstream from this, a few different headphone amplifiers were used. My big gun, the LTA Z10E, which you see right up there behind me, was one that got a lot of time. Hi-Fi-Man Golden Wave Prelude, Vioelectric HPA V281. Those would have been the 3 main amplifiers that I used, headphone amps that I used to check there. I'm a primarily headphone user here. Headphones that I would have used, you see one of them behind me, that is the Hi-Fi-Man Susvara, the original. Moving out of the way right there a little bit, I have the Hi-Fi-Man HE1000 unveiled in for review, so that got a fair amount of time. I just recently reviewed the Hi-Fi-Man Isvarna, so that also was a headphone that was used here rather frequently. I also tried Focal Utopia. I have the ZMF Caldera, both open and closed, in for review, and it was specifically the open model that I used a lot with this as well, just because I haven't had as much time to get to the closed model on there either. Okay, there was likely other test gear in there along the way, but I think that is enough to say that I've tried several different combinations of things to get to the sound here. I also did some comparisons of this DAC versus like the Shit Bifrost 2/64, the Live Harmony DAC, my Cord Hugo 2, and then also my big guns, the Berkeley Alpha Series 2, which is behind me. You're probably not going to see it. And then if you see the tubes sticking out of it, you're not going to see where I'm pointing there. Anyway, there is a Lampezator Baltic 3 DAC right behind me and behind those headphones hanging on the side of my equipment rack there that also compared this thing against. And so I will get to those comparisons and how they help me judge where this sits in the market here after we talk about the sound of this unit. So let's talk about the sound of this unit. All right, 10,000 foot view of the perceived frequency response and presentation here is that it is a mostly neutral, perhaps slightly leaning bright kind of perceived frequency response presentation here. This is a departure from some Denafrips of old, particularly the OG Pontus 2 before it had the 12th anniversary edition firmware update, and a little bit more like the old Denafrips Aries 2. It's a departure from that in terms of how like those older units were like warmer and thicker sounding in their presentation. This one is much more neutral, again perhaps even leaning bright there. A thing that stood out to me is that there is a fair amount of treble energy that comes through. Now it does not add sibilance in, it's nice, clean, clear, and well tonally balanced treble, but there does seem to be like just a bit of a perception of a slight treble shelf to it, at least to my ear, and that does extend down into the upper mids a little bit, so the tonal balance in the mids does just pull it up slightly in terms of like where the perceived anchoring point is of the mid-range, if you will, there. So my ears do detect just a hint of brightness beyond what I would consider true neutral, but I think it's still mostly in the range that most people are going to consider it a neutral presentation in terms of perceived frequency response. Presentational aspects here is that it is quite smooth and it is refined. It does have some of the stereotypical R2R or ladder DAC sound to it, where it is smooth, it is refined, and it's just got this like, it flows well, right? Like it's just got this nice flow to it. It is well balanced on the wet dry spectrum. So like the timings of attacks and decays to me sounds pretty natural and organic, and that is usually one of the strengths of R2R designs, and that comes out here too as well. The sound stage is pretty big. You get a very spacious sound here. I think that the slight treble emphasis to the frequency response may aid in that perception of space just a little bit, but however it does have a very large, expansive sound stage that is pretty well balanced in the 3 dimensions, and it has a lot of depth, right? And so like that's one of the things that like stands out to me over of this unit over something that's under $1,000, and where I talk about how this fits into the market, is that this produces a better sense of depth into the soundstage with layering and all of that to go on in terms of like the spatial performance and all of that. Now, the resolution and the detail retrieval on this unit I would not call staggering or standout or really one of the key features, but nor is it lacking either. There is a lot of detail and texturing and resolution to the sound here, but it is a more laid back and smooth presentation in terms of how it does it. And so like if you are a person who just, you love the details and you got to hear everything, it is not a detail emphasizing DAC, but also it doesn't pull it back so much that it feels like it's veiled or anything like that in its normal presentation either. A similar thing can be said about the dynamics and the impact of the sound here too. It has decent bass extension and okay bass presence, but there are definitely other DACs out there that are going to emphasize the deep bass, the sub bass, and the low end a little bit more than this one does, which I think also aids in that slight perception of brightness that I was talking about earlier here. And then the bass like has some impact to it, but again, it's not really the sound that this unit is going for. It is not a head slammer. It's not going to rattle you around or anything like that. But it does still have like good, healthy snap on snare drum hits and that sort of thing. So the dynamics and the liveliness of the sound, like, again, they are there, they are not lacking, but they are also not emphasized or featured parts of the presentation on this. I think you're really going for refinement, smoothness, and the sense of space if you get into a DAC like this. And again, it's not that it's poorly resolving or that it's poorly dynamic. No, it's just that those latter two traits are not the features of the sound of this in the way that the spatial presentation and the overall smoothness and refinement refinement are, and then if you like the slightly brighter leaning sound to it overall on that too. Those are just all things that you need to consider. Now, as we start getting into the performance options, depending on how you use this DAC, you know, things don't change a ton. Like the nature of the sound of this DAC does not completely change if you go from oversampling to non-oversampling, or if you use everyday sampling rates up to about 192 kilohertz, as opposed to going all the way up to its, you know, 1536 kilohertz capability in there. It doesn't dramatically and wholesale change its nature, but some of its technical abilities do change a little bit, and so let's start talking about that here. So let's stick with, for the moment, just everyday sampling rates up to 192 kilohertz and up to like just regular DSD64. What happens when you use Oz or the non-oversampling, Oz-Noz here. So I mentioned 2 digital filters in here, and I ended up personally preferring the slow filter. Your mileage may vary on that. I had to work really hard to find sonic differences between the oversampling filter and the non-oversampling on this for those everyday sampling rates. I thought that the slow filter, the one that I personally preferred, was the easier one to detect differences with between the non-oversampling and what the oversampling filter was doing. It was very, very hard to detect the difference between the fast filter and the non-oversampling filter. What does that mean? I think that means that generally the 2 oversampling filters on here are pretty good. They do a fairly decent job of at least not messing up the sound, okay, as compared to what the non-oversampling does. But that's not as good as they should be, because this DAC, and we'll get to this in a little bit more here shortly, but this DAC really lights up, okay, and becomes a better expression of itself when you feed it highly oversampled files that either come from HQP or PGGB, right? So in theory then, the built-in oversampling filters here should at least be better than what the non-oversampling does, because they are basically doing the same job as those external oversamplers. They're just doing it inside rather than outside. So the fact that there was not a clear performance boost for me using either of the oversampling filters on here suggests to me that they're just kind of there, more or less. Now, they do sound slightly different, particularly the slow filter. They do sound slightly different than the non-oversampling here. I thought that the slow filter sounded just a little bit more natural and organic in its sound compared to straight Nas, just a little bit. And it made the Nas sound just slightly veiled. Okay, in comparison, it was not that veiled feeling, was not something that stuck around for very long. It'd be like the first few seconds of a song, and then I'm into the music, and it's fine after that. Okay, so that just comes back to the built-in oversampling is okay, but it does leave some potential performance on the floor for you here. So that's just something to keep in mind if the bulk of your listening is going to be at 44.1 to 192 kilohertz or just DSD64. All right, so then what happens when you do feed this the really highly oversampled files from something like HQP or PGGB? And so I made sure to go all the way up to the 1536 kilohertz for both of those file types there, and I used the USB input, okay, when I did this here. And I'll talk about input performance here in just a moment. And the truth of the matter is again, this thing, it lights up with the highly oversampled files. And it doesn't completely change its sonic character, as I mentioned. It just becomes a better expression of itself. It's still going to be that mostly neutral but leaning bright kind of frequency response. But just like the timing aspects improve a little bit, so like the timings of attacks and decays become a little bit more natural to me. I think it actually becomes a little bit more smooth and refined sounding in its overall presentation there. And the sense of space, the holography and all that, like the separation and the layering of the sound and all of that from spatially comes out even more here, and it sounds much, it creates a more organic and natural sound with just a better and more realistic and natural timbre to it. It just sounds closer to real life there with those highly oversampled files when you engage the non-oversampling mode here, and again, using PGGB files or HQP. So I do think that like the upgrade path for this, if you were to buy one of these, you really don't have to buy a new DAC. Like if you are upgrading to this DAC from something under $1,000, you will get a bit of a performance boost, okay? And then you can get another performance boost again if you were to, instead of buying a new DAC, you were to invest in HQP, something that could do HQP, or you were to get a license for PGGB and upsample all of your local files and that sort of thing. I am working on a video. I have both PGGB and HQP in it. In the future, when I can get to it, I will break down those two options in more detail, okay, again in a future video, but that could be a ways off just because I'm busy, hopefully summer, but we'll see. Okay, on here, but like they do help this DAC, and that creates an upgrade path by keeping this unit and not having to just buy a new DAC. All right. So then talking comparisons, and again, helping me figure out like where this fits in the market, I did a couple of comparisons here directly to it. I got my Shit Bifrost 2/64 out, and I connected that and the Pontus 15th here via coaxial input from the dual coaxial outputs on my Singer SU6 DDC, which was in turn connected to a Sonor Ultra Rendu as a Rune endpoint here. And then I just manually plugged and unplugged the balance outputs of both this and the Bifrost 2 into my Vioelectric HPA V281 amp. And for this test, that comparison, I used the HE1000 unveiled headphone. Review for that coming up very shortly, I hope, okay, to do a comparison here. And I left this one in its oversampling mode with the slow filter, which was just my personal preference of the three options of fast, slow, non for everyday regular sampling rates, which you basically have to do via coax input anyway. And I did end up overall thinking that the Pontus 15th here was the better of the two DACs, which I mean this one should be because it's pushing twice the price of the Bifrost 2. Okay, and what I notice here is like the Bifrost 2 has a slightly warmer overall character to it, and it has more sub-bass energy and impact and dynamics to the sound. Like some of the traits of Shit's house sound is that they tend to have a lot of dynamics to them, and they are generally quite slammy and active in the sub-bass and all that, and then they also have very good timbre. But this unit here matched the Bifrost on timbre. I don't think it was quite as slammy or as bassy as the Bifrost 2 is. Okay, but really those are about the only areas where the Bifrost 2 was either equal to or ahead of the Pontus 15th here, because in every other way, the Pontus 2, like it had a more natural tonal balance to it. Like even though its upper mids and its treble sound a little bit more forward, they are smoother. So like the Bifrost 2 just sounded a little bit more fatiguing to me at the same volume levels. It just made my ears tired, you know, through the upper mids and the treble faster than this one did. And so this one just also sounded like smoother and more refined and all of that kind of stuff in its spatial in its presentation there. The sense of space is also bigger and more three-dimensional and more holographic, okay, for the Pontus 15th compared to the Bifrost 2. And this one is also more resolving. So even though the resolution is not a standout feature of this unit, you still get a bump in resolution over something like a Bifrost 2. And for my money, the Bifrost 2 is like one of the best examples of a current DAC under $1,000 US right now, to which this would be an upgrade from. Okay, it's been a while since I've heard it, but like how does this vary from like the original Pontus 2 that I heard? Other than the fact that with the original Pontus 2's original firmware, this is a brighter sound, where the Pontus 2 was like a much warmer and thicker kind of sound. This one, I think probably is a little bit more, just a technical improvement, a little bit more resolution, a little bit more overall holography, and that sort of thing on it. This one is also more amp pairing friendly, generally speaking, because like the old Pontus 2, because of its warmer sound, like you had to be careful what DAC you plug it into, and like it was just too warm, too thick, and too just kind of muddy kind of sounding if I plug that into my Vio HPA V281 amp, which is already like a warmer, thicker kind of tube-like, stereotypical tube-like sound to it, where this paired really well with the HPA V281. And there, so there's some differences for you there. Now, this DAC does not quite reach up and catch something like a Hugo 2 or a Live Harmony DAC up there in terms of its overall performance in there. I let this DAC handle like upsampled files, gave it its best performance that I could in there, and then I just used my Hugo 2 at standard sampling rates, wired them both into my LTA back there, this one via XLR and the Hugo 2 via RCA, and that's okay because the LTA is a single-ended amp that has a balanced input and has very high quality balanced to single-ended conversion on board, so I think that was a pretty fair test. And I would say that with the oversampled files, that it's just kind of, versus the Hugo 2 on standard bitrate files, that they were pretty close to even. Now, the Hugo 2 has a more impactful, active, energetic sound, and the Hugo 2 had a little bit fuller low end on it and all of that. But in terms of overall refinement, spatial presentation, three-dimensionality, holography, those kinds of things, I thought the Pontus 15th here with the upsampled files and in its NOS mode was pretty even with the Hugo 2 on those things. So with those upsampled files, it does seem to punch up a little bit, okay, in terms of what it can handle. Now, it doesn't quite catch the Live Harmony in overall there. And then, of course, if you let the Hugo 2 or the Live Harmony also get upsampled files where they also perform very well, then the performance gap comes back again where those two are, you know, kind of clearly ahead of this unit. But those analyses just kind of told me that, yeah, I think $1,500 is quite a fair price for what you're getting in terms of performance from this DAC. Now, how does this stack up against my Berkeley or my Lampezator? And it's like just not in the class of those two, right? Those two are you know, $5,500, $6,600 kind of DACs, and they are definitely a class ahead, couple of classes ahead of what this is. All right, so just, you know, keep those kinds of things in mind. All right, last thing to talk about then, as I mentioned, like which inputs do you want to use here? It was very difficult to really discern a meaningful difference in performance between the USB and the I2S input here. Both of those inputs will accept all of the sampling rates up to the 1536 kilohertz PCM and the DSD 1024. So it's really just going to be like, what are your system needs? Do you have something with a quality USB output? Then fine, just use the USB. Make it easier on yourself. Or does your source gear sound better from its I2S input? Okay, sure, then use that then, right? So I think they're both good enough that it's just going to come down to whatever you want to use. Now, did I think the sound from the coax input here was pretty good? Again, coming from the Singer SU6, which is a high quality output anyway. Yes, that was also pretty good. So if you have a CD transport or something like that that you're going to want to use, and you're okay just using the 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz conversion in here without any external oversampling or anything, then the coax input sounded fine as well. There were no issues there. All right, so I think basically we can wrap this up then. I think this is a solid unit. If you are a fan of the older, warmer Denafrips sound, this is a departure from that. So that's just something that you need to keep in mind. For everyone else, is either, you know, wants a more neutral sound, maybe a slightly brighter sound, or is just looking to get into an upgrade from something under $1,000, you know, like what's the next step? This is a pretty solid option for that, provided that you have a good sturdy shelf to put it on and you're not going to be moving it around a lot, okay, and that sort of thing. And then again, if you want to play around with external upsamplers like PGGB or HQP, you do get a nice performance bump through this DAC, which gives you more options for upgrade paths rather than just having to buy a whole new DAC that's more expensive all over again. So that's something to consider as well. All right, I'm Wave Theory. This has been my review of the Denafrips Pontus 15th Anniversary Edition. Please remember to like, subscribe, comment, check out my PayPal and my Patreon. Generally do those things you do to support YouTube channels, and as always, enjoy the music.